I'd like to welcome everyone to a special session, a video dialogue on the topic of feminism, technology, and the archive. I'm Ann Balsamo, one of the co-facilitators of the distributed open collaborative course called Dialogues in Feminism and Technology. And I'm delighted today to introduce our video dialogue participants for this evening. And so let me start with B. Ruby Rich is a professor of film and digital media in the Social Documentation program at the University of California in Santa Cruz. And previously, she taught in the film program at the University of California at Berkeley. Ruby is the author of the recent book published earlier this year by Duke University Press called New Queer Cinema, The Director's Cut. I learned last night that she's also the new editor of Film Quarterly, one of the most respected and long-lasting journals, film journals in the United States. Her previous book, published in 1998, also by Duke University Press, was titled Chick Flicks, Theories and Memories of the Feminist Film Movement. Ruby has a distinguished career as a film critic, curator, documentarian, journalist, who has participated as a juror and program organizer for several of the major film festivals throughout the world. Our second participant this evening, Lynn Hirschman Leeson, is an internationally acclaimed artist who works, of course, as you know, across many media forms. Her artwork is featured in public collections of the Wilhelm Lembrecht Museum, the ZKM Museum in Germany, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Tate Modern, the National Gallery of Canada, the Walker Art Center, and the Museum of Modern Art here in New York. She received the DVelop Digital Art Award in Berlin in recognition of lifetime achievement in the field of media. She has also received a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Scholarship. A major retrospective and catalog, actually I learned, is scheduled for 2014 at ZKM Museum in Germany and the Museum der Moderne Museum in Salzburg. 5 of her feature films, including The Electronic Diary, Conceiving Ada, Technolust, Strange Culture, and Women Art Revolution, have been showcased at the Sundance Film Festival, the Toronto Film Festival, and the Berlin International Film Festival, among others. I know this. So I'm going to begin with a simple question that actually asks both of you to reflect on your own histories and your biographies, to talk about the intersections of tonight's kind of theme of feminism, technology, and the archive. And perhaps each of you could describe a few of those formative moments as you're in your work as a curator, as an artist, as a critic, where the question of the archive became a more pressing kind of issue for you to consider.
Well, I remember in the 70s, it suddenly dawned on me that many women had no history because they weren't in history. And that, I think, was an impetus for thinking about the artifacts and the discards and the collection of what in painting is called the negative space, the space around something that forms it. And I think that was, most of the things that I do come on the cusp of disaster, something disastrous having happened. It was around that time, 1972, when I had an exhibition that closed because I used media, and they said media wasn't an art form. And I opened a room up in a hotel that did more than what the exhibition could have done. And I think that was one of the foundation thoughts of that, was to collect the artifacts and the all of the ephemera that were collected as part of that, and I've been doing that ever since.
Excellent. And what project was that? What was the project?
It was called the Dante Hotel, but that was a
Hotel.
precursor to a project called Roberta. Roberta's was all about that kind of shadow and the essence that isn't normally thought of as say, an art product, but things that define reality and really are the edge or the blurring of what defines something, a space or an idea.
Or an identity.
Or an identity,
right.
Exactly.
Right, because I mean, in some respects, Roberta, the project was a kind of living archive.
She was,
right?
absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. And then, it seemed like I just collected everything in my life. And finally, there was 118 boxes of things that, in order to not declare bankruptcy, went to Stanford, and that became another kind of an archive. So when I made Women Art Revolution, that had 12,000 hours of footage shot over 42 years, and I started to think, how can you tell a story that's 90 or 70 minutes long when you have all of this material? And so again, I went to Stanford, and they did, as kind of a test of this, they digitized everything, and it's all available. So I understand that they took part of Ruby's interview. I mean, it's 17 hours at UT Chicago, 12 hours at Carolina State, and they took part of Ruby's interview in Australia in a panel and played it to open up a topic. So this is there always. Mm-hmm. And simultaneously, when I did that project, I thought, well, wouldn't it be great to have a site where people could also upload material. Mm-hmm. And that led to Raw War, which is open for people to contribute and to meet each other, and to Stanford didn't want to do it because they're afraid of pornography if people started uploading onto their site. So we did our own, and that also became a site for literal revelation and meeting in communities to come, and that could not have been made before that year because the technology didn't exist before the year that it surfaced. And the same with, I made an artificial intelligence project called Agent Ruby. Now, Agent Ruby started in 2000 as part of Technolust, and she's still living. And this is a project that never dies. So you can't really, you think about archiving something that's always gathering more information. Mm-hmm. So after a decade, we made 10 books of the 80,000 planks of material that existed from people talking to her all over the world, and kind of got a mirror of what people were thinking about through that time. So
I want to come back to that question, come back about the technology and the platforms of archiving in a bit, but can we talk a little bit or hear a little bit from you about kind of those formative moments in your history where the notion of the archive?
So you want the origin myths?
Sure, yes,
Yeah.
of course.
Well, for me, it was really coming of age in the 70s under the spell of feminism, and being involved all through that with film, because I began working in film exhibition within a year of graduating from college. I just went sort of straight into it and had an old-fashioned apprenticeship and learned my trade by, projecting films, writing program notes, selling tickets, entertaining everyone from King Vidor to Jill Godmillo and Nellie Kaplan. And at that time, the late Gene Siskel was the film critic at the Chicago Tribune, and called me up all excited because he'd come back from Army Reserve duty in DC and had gone to see a film in a women's film festival, this new thing that was showing at this new place called the AFI. And he said, we have to have this in Chicago. Will you run this? And I said, oh, I couldn't possibly do that. We have to form a collective. So I organized this huge group of women who proceeded to organize a film festival and fight with each other for the following year. And I began to go to meetings with the marketing department at the Chicago Tribune, because that's who was funding it, to change their image. And I would buy cigars, which I didn't smoke, so I could smoke cigars in the meetings with them to get some respect, because I felt that they wouldn't have any respect for me. And we managed to pull off this event. It was at the Art Institute of Chicago, where the Film Center had just started. By 5 years later, I was the associate director and then left. But at that time, I was learning as fast as I could. And we were inspired not just by Gene Siskel's call, but by a festival that had just been held in Toronto. And it so happens that this is the 40th anniversary of the Women in Film Festival in Toronto. And they've just been holding commemorative events there. And in those days, before the internet, before streaming, before Netflix, before video, before email, the only way you could find out about things was either to travel and go to other film festivals, which is what real curators did, or by getting the catalogs and then blindly trying to replicate what they had done so that you could see for yourself what it had been. And that's what we were busy doing. And this was the very moment of beginning to research and establish an archive of women's cinema, not an actual archive of collecting the films, but an archive of writing about them and of creating the experience for other people so that there could be witnesses to the fact that, yes, women have been making films, and yes, they had already been erased from history in the 70s. And that was a very, very formative moment for me because I got to see these films, meet these women, and also because I discovered that if you have a major newspaper backing you, and that newspaper orders its film critic to review what you are showing almost on a daily basis and gives free ads in the paper to what you are doing, you can get 10,000 people to come downtown, where at that time in the 70s they did not go, to come downtown to that old city of the 1970s and see these films. And it became a cultural milestone in the city of Chicago. People would come up to me for years after talking about how it had changed their lives. And I discovered that if you are not assumed to be a marginal event, you weren't a marginal event. And that lesson has stayed with me ever since, when people try to say that the reason these films aren't shown is that there's no audience. The reason these films aren't written about is that nobody is interested, because I know that, in fact, is not true. So that was very formative for me at the level of filmmaking and film exhibition. The other thing that was just as important was the feminist writing that was being done at that time. I met Adrienne Rich, I met Audre Lorde, I was reading what they were writing. We were all reading each other. I was reading, I mean, I was very junior to them, but they encouraged me, which was great. I was reading Signs, I was reading Feminist Studies, I was getting copies of Feminist Review by boat from London. All of this was happening. I was reading and writing for Heresies, I was reading and writing for Chrysalis. I wrote for Feminist Review, I wrote for Feminist Studies, I wrote for Signs eventually. Some of that in the 80s rather than the 70s. But there was a ferment that was ongoing and that was shared. And so it didn't require as much effort to do something on your own, because you were carried along by the current, by the salt in the ocean of that wonderful, wonderful spirit and energy that really carried you beyond your own abilities. And I feel very lucky to have started that way. And that's what happened for me again in the 80s and 90s with what I call new queer cinema and this whole second wave in a slightly different way, different community, but with parallels to how people were inspired by film and how, in turn, what was going on in society inspired filmmakers to do work. And that really is, it's a myth, but it's also, I would claim, an archive in history.
Excellent, excellent. So I want to ask you about the confidence game essay and connect it to an early formative moment that you spoke about earlier about how you have to invent certain things in order to bring your work into legitimacy. And so can you talk a little bit about the argument in the confidence game? And,
yeah, I'll try. You may know it better than I. But I gave a talk about a year and a half ago on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the Women Make Movies organization. And subsequently, that whole session of talks from an academic conference was gathered together into a special section of the journal Camera Obscura, where it resides behind the firewall of JSTOR. And the essay that I wrote, I entitled The Confidence Game, because I wanted to take up this question of why there aren't more women filmmakers and why we don't know about the women filmmakers that there are. And I told a story in that article that I got from Nikki Caro, the wonderful New Zealand filmmaker who made a little film you may have heard of called The Whale Rider. And she went on to make North Country and a number of other films. And I gave Whale Rider the world premiere when I was a guest curator at the Toronto Film Festival in 2002. And she told me subsequently, because we've met up again over the years, that when she decided to go to film school to become a filmmaker, she had to leave New Zealand, there were no film schools, and apply to a university in Australia. And when she got there, she was so excited that she got in, and when she arrived, she discovered she was the only woman in the entire school. And she was furious and raced down to the admissions office to protest. And they told her how upset they were that they couldn't get women to come to the school. Because when women applied, they sent in these wonderful applications. They were excited. They wanted to bring them. And then they said, please just, we need a sample of your work. And at that moment, without exception, all of the women said, oh, I don't have anything that's ready. I don't have anything that's good enough to show you, and went away. And the men sent in stuff that sometimes was great and sometimes was wretched. And if they got refused, they would apply over and over, sure the school had made a mistake. And she was the only woman who had ever followed through and actually had the confidence to say, oh yeah, I have something, here it is. And we talked about that. And I remembered back in these early days of the 70s with these women's film festivals that everyone thought the reason there weren't more women filmmakers was that the technology was too intimidating. Therefore, the idea was to start these workshops so women could get used to this scary technology of 16 millimeter or video portapacks and begin to make work. And, you know, to a very small extent, that worked. Well, of course, no one talks today about how difficult it is to use digital cameras. And yet, why do we still have the same problem of there not being women? There's more women in film schools, perhaps, but there aren't necessarily more women being reviewed in the newspaper, being featured in film festivals, getting distribution, being released in status collections of DVDs. And it seems to me that the problem goes much further back, and that the problem is a psychological as much as an institutional or technological one, and that it has to do with the mothers and fathers we all had. Mm-hmm. And the fact that girls are not allowed to make fools of themselves, that girls aren't given their head, that girls aren't taught to stand up and boss around a room full of men, and that anyone who walks onto a film set and can't command the crew is going to get shredded. And this then carries on. It carries on to who is reviewing the films. In this meltdown of journalism today, how many women critics are employed at newspapers in the United States? 2. Manola Dargis at New York Times and Ann Hornaday at the Washington Post. I don't know of any others. So who is reviewing the films that women might actually break through to make? Who is showing them? Who are the curators? Variety just announced the third in its team of 3 staff critics. They're all 3 men. So we have, you know, these crises do not go away. These crises come back around, come back around, come back around. But in the confidence game, I tried to talk about the fact that status gives you confidence. The more status you have, the more confident you can become. Get the corner office with the view out from the 33rd floor. You'll be much more confident in your dealings with people. Get accepted into the right Ivy League school or public university. Get accepted into the right graduate program. Get shown at Sundance. Get shown at Cannes. You will have more confidence.
So I have to segue to Lynn. So you had a very novel approach to the fact that there weren't critics poised to evaluate your early work. So how did you approach that?
Yeah, I was invisible. I did want to say that I've always made a fool of myself. I kind of like doing it. I find it really an advantage because it just gives you a lot of freedom when you don't care. But in the early days, what I consider now the early days, again, of the 70s, women weren't shown in art galleries. I mean, they just were not. And you could not get your work shown or reviewed under any circumstances. So my solution was to create 3 critics. The names were Herbert Good, Gaya Bannon, and Prudence Juris. And they would write from everything from local throwaway newspapers that you got against your door to an art weekly to a very prestigious international magazine. And of course, they would write about me. almost exclusively, and they all wrote in different styles, and sometimes they would start fighting about with each other
About the meaning of your work.
about the meaning of my work. And whenever I could, I put photographs also to legitimize and add some stature to it. And then I was able to take these articles into galleries. And they were so surprised, one, that somebody had written in all these magazines about this work, that's how I got my first exhibition. But I think a lot of it is really about, people say, well, is that really ethical? Well, it's just as ethical as not being seen or not being looked at or not being
Right.
taken seriously.
Right.
But I think the question is really about value and how one can negotiate value in our culture just for who they are, for what they're accomplishing and adding to the society. So it's figuring that out. And I think that you have to really be clever in order to make some systemic changes. I know that there's some people now in museums like the Modern that give a significant amount of money only to buy women's work when they found out that there's only 3% still, in the collection. So then curators would go out, are going out and are starting to look for work that could fit into receiving that kind of funding. And I think that that's something that can grow and viralize as more people take that strategy.
I mean, so you're exactly pointing out the kind of the paradox of the archive, right? In the sense that we assume that the archive is a compendium of things that have had value, right? But if things have not been institutionally sanctioned to have kind of value, how do they show up in the institutional form of the archive?
It doesn't have to be valued before it becomes an archive.
Well,
I think you have to believe in it. And
that's
I think
the connection.
if one does, and the conscientious game and the confidence game, if they keep the work that people think that you ought to discard and think isn't worth anything, the fact that you're doing that gives it value, gives it a level of value, and it's about survival. It's about history and kind of anti-invisibility and creating some thread that could be pulled later when the work does become more vital. And sometimes it could take 40 or 50 years in order to do that. But you have to believe in it to save it.
That's right. And so I want to
Quite
ask
literally
a
save it.
question about the connection between art, the archive, and activism. Because in some respects, what you're just talking about is archiving as a mode of activism.
Well, there's this interesting effort going on right now by women writers and a sort of feminist literary group called Vita that are compiling statistics on the number of women writers being reviewed in every single literary journal in the country and the New York Times Book Review. And they are publishing these, and they are shaming these journals. They are going through, they have huge teams of women working on this, compiling how many women's books have been reviewed and how many women's bylines appear as reviewers. And Paris Review is pretty much the worst. And Tin House turned around its statistics in 1 year by only soliciting work from women because the men come anyway. And it's been very, very interesting to watch what's happening with that. We don't have anything like that in art right now. We had for a minute the Guerrilla Girl posters. That was a long time ago. And they were anonymous. These women are not anonymous. And we don't have anything remotely like that in film. And I'm hoping that will change because I'm fascinated by the way in which something that is called taste actually masks ideology. And I'm beginning to think that the wrong words are being used and that we really need to start talking about this as a form of gender bullying. Since bullying is a very popular word that seems to get attention and even legal action now, I think we need to claim that there is gender bullying going on in the film profession. I don't think that the film industry is actually an industry or a business. I think it's a medieval guild, and it lives in a castle with a moat around it. And I think it's right now one of the worst moments I've seen in many years for women trying to have careers in filmmaking. And I'm also concerned about the way the archive is being applied right now under the banner of cinephilia. Because the true film lovers now are cinephiles, and cinephilia is redeeming works from the past that may have been forgotten. Guess how many of them are by women? 0? You're right. And I think that this notion of cinephilia at this moment is being used to resurrect some of the worst attitudes that we thought we were done with, and to exclude women all over again. And technology itself would seem to be a route to the archive for us, but in fact, it's also at the same moment the opposite. So much women's filmmaking has been lost in the move to digital. We are handed the banner of total availability. Now, through the wonders of the digital world, you can see everything. And yet, most of the films that I've loved through the 70s and 80s are no longer available. And so, let alone before. And a lot of the writing isn't either. And so I think that this notion of technology and this notion of the archive and this notion of feminist activism have to be brought together in a new way for the current crisis that we're in.
I want to say that I read today that George Baselitz had an interview in The Independent where he said that women can't paint. I mean, he said that today. It's impossible to have a woman artist painter because they physically can't do it. And yeah, unbelievable.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, let's talk a little bit more about the issues of technology and the archive, because I think we are promised with every new the emergence of every new technological platform, we are, and these platforms of reproduction, we are promised a kind of perfect archival memories machine, right? We are promised that, the claims of, higher resolution, some sort of, ideals of fidelity and so on, that these platforms will enable kind of a more perfect memory and a more perfect process of remembering, right? But the point that you're making, and this is the question I was asking you, is, you're making the point that every day we forget more than we remember, and that our technologies are not helping us, so that with the move from DVD collections or video collections to DVD to the web, that in fact we're losing memories, that every day we're forgetting more, things are actually decaying more than they are being preserved.
I mean, one wonders if Baselitz always got things upside down anyway, you have to say that.
Women can't paint because they don't have opposable
No,
palms?
his paintings go upside down. It's kind of like shedding skin. I mean, you think that you're losing your memory or you can't remember, but we could remember in our DNA structure everything that we went through, every evolution. There's memory of us when we were chameleons, when we went through every process to become the humans that we are, and that could right now be accessed. So our memory is there, even though it can't, under normal circumstances, without technology, be accessed and extracted. Just a few years ago, Elizabeth Blackburn won the Nobel Prize for identifying the aging gene called the telomere. Well, the telomere was always there, but it needed the technology to be able to see it and to bring it forward into this beautiful way, and to realize kind of the dissonance of that remapping of something that was dislocated and not identifiable from anything that had existed before. So I think that we have to really take our own action, because we do have the processes to create a reliable history, or one that's more reliable than it has been in the past, and find means in order to ensure that these histories are being recorded and are being remembered and can be accessed. And I think that there are places around the world that can do that. So rather than feeling victimized by the fact that there are some places that don't have inclusive attitudes or philosophies, I think that one has to either invent or find a place that does.
So I'm going to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on the notion of DNA and memory in the context of the new project, because on the one hand, when I hear your explanation or your description here, I'm thinking, well, I understand the memory of the species is within my DNA.
Of evolution.
But is it, are the memory and the reproduction of all those films in my DNA? So my question is about
Only if they've been seen.
Well, that's what I want to know. My question is about cultural reproduction and cultural memory
And cultural scarring.
and cultural scarring. So talk a little bit about the Infinity Lab and the
Infinity Engine.
the Infinity Engine and the DNA as memory and the DNA as kind of cultural encoding project that's coming down the.
Yeah, I'm right now building a genetics lab as an art installation, as well as making a film about that. And one of the things that kind of tickles me is that in the next month we will be putting the material that's in the lab and the footage that we've already shot forward and reconstructing that as DNA itself that can then later hopefully be incorporated into the piece itself. So
Okay, so let me get this. So the film
Yeah.
is going to be encoded as DNA.
yes,
And then
millions of copies.
and then the DNA will be expressed as a body part? No, just as
No, it'll just be a thing.
It'll just be the DNA.
It'll just be the DNA.
So the DNA
Is a conversion.
is a conversion of the
because
film.
everything is all of
Right.
these elements that could always be restructured and changed. And
Right.
we have our choices as to what we will take and what hybrid we'll extend it towards.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know how to follow up on that
Yeah,
one.
right, that's,
Because I'm still wrapping my head around the film being encoded as DNA.
Well,
well, we've been wondering what's next. We've gone
Right.
from film
Right.
to VHS to beta. We've had, DVDs, we have Blu-rays, we have streaming, we have BitTorrent,
YouTube,
and
we
now
have the
in the
Internet
future,
Archive, right.
evidently, we have DNA.
We have DNA. So we will
Beyond the horizon. But
So DNA will be a
yeah.
recording medium
it is.
for cultural memories, not only.
I mean, they already
Biology.
are. I mean, if there is a cultural scarring, that goes on to your progeny. Just in the same way that the memory of other species that made humans in their history still remains.
Okay, I'm going to bring it back to the whole opposite end of this,
Good.
right? Because one of the quotations that I put as an epigram at the beginning of Chick Flicks was a quotation from the great filmmaker Chris Marker from Sans Soleil, in which he said, talking about the past, he said, "Who cares about all that? History throws its empty bottles out the window." And I really took this to heart because the reason that I wrote both books, and I think the reason that I do a lot of what I do, is to make sure that those empty bottles aren't thrown out the window, to make sure that these histories are carried forward into the present and into the future. Because what I have seen as the biggest impediment to creation, to creativity, to agency, is the erasure of histories. And I think that happens in a different way now, in a moment in which we are the objects of a massive information overload. It becomes harder and harder to hold on to what's already rushed past. And at the same time, I think that we are more and more shaped by this onslaught, that we're at a transitional moment when those sorting mechanisms aren't really in place. And we're being told that we each have the ability to do this. We each have our own beautiful, perfect, exceptional, individual ability to do this, which, by the way, is not being exercised. And so, therefore, we are more and more the victims of advertising campaigns. We're more and more subject to the sways of marketing because we don't find what's behind that because so much is coming at us. And so I think that at a moment like this, legacies and genealogies are really crucial, and they're, we'll all come back to DNA. Everyone wants their DNA testing kit to see where they came from in their specialness and how we all were once Queen of Egypt or whatever. And instead, I think the cultural histories, cultural genealogies, the genealogies of our fields, the contributions of the people that came before us are absolutely crucial if we're to get out of this rather debased present moment and find our way again and get anchored again in a soil that has the richness of what's been buried there, that we can tap into and revivify and use to make new work. So I think that's a lot of what I'm about, that a lot of what I do is a sort of salvage mission, to preserve what's happening now, to get attention for it, so that it doesn't wither away, and also to keep dragging back what's been there in the past. I was recently in Toronto and gave a talk in which I showed clips from a wonderful documentary, Forbidden Love. And it's the only lesbian film that the National Film Board of Canada ever produced. It never was released digitally. There's nothing but some dusty VHS tapes left of it. And I talked about what a scandal this was, and a number of people were in the audience, and a campaign has now started to try to get that put back into circulation, get it available, and get it digitized. But there are many, many, many women's films that I would argue are disproportionately unavailable now in this wonderful digital wonderland of total accessibility.
What about the fuller range of art forms that, and much of the work that you've been involved with, which is, from the performative, kind of more, temporally ephemeral kind of moment, to the interactive work, to now the new work. So, if you can talk a little bit about the social institutions of archiving.
Well, I think
Right.
that they're working on it. I
Okay.
mean, there are groups right now. In fact, there's a meeting at the Smithsonian in 2 weeks to deal with how one does archive works that are constantly changing and that aren't fixed and that are ephemeral. So that whole idea of conservation and retrieval is something that's just being looked at as an important part of recording our history, our present. That becomes our history in the future.
Because the Roberta Project, we now saw photographs that MoMA just acquired, right, on the Roberta Project. So we have some traces of the project, of the performance.
The trace was the project.
And right.
I mean, she was a shadow person. There's nothing that was not ordinary about her, and she never she never revealed herself until she didn't exist. So that tracing was kind of the core. And I was thinking, what if the bottles that were thrown out the window, went into a stream, and that becomes part of the time, a time level of archive that is always there. Can anything really disappear? Is there always an archaeology that could retrieve whatever is discarded?
Well,
even
as it
dusty
happens,
VHSs.
As it happens,
tapes.
I started out as an archaeologist.
How did I know that?
I did this one of the careers I didn't take, but I did study it in school, and I did, traipse around the Yucatan looking for traditional cave carvings that I found. But yes, of course, archaeology can discover that which is buried. But it's a lot easier to discover things when they're not buried, okay? I think that there's a real distinction between those two. And then there's the whole question of what is being willfully buried versus what is simply passing downstream with the fullness of time. Some things get a little help, and that concerns me because the burials are not equitable, all right? Let's just put it that way. Nor is the archaeology, frankly, equally funded. So while this may be true in principle, it may not turn out to be true in practice.
Can you tell the Nikki Caro story about how you found her film? Wasn't it at the edge of a desk?
Oh,
because
yeah.
maybe it's just putting these spells on things. That's what
Yes. Well, when I was working in Toronto in 2002 as a curator, one of the things I was looking for, and in fact asked to do, was to look for women's films. And it was a terrible amount of work. I don't know that I've ever worked that hard. I now salute film festival curators. And there was this file drawer that would fill every day. And every day I would work all day long in the office and then go home and screen work till 2 in the morning and then come back and the drawer would be full again. Like every day I would empty it and every day it would be full again. And one night at around midnight, I put on like this final VHS for the night that was by someone I'd never heard of. It didn't have any stars. It wasn't quite finished. It didn't have the music yet. It didn't have the titles. And I put it on, and it turned out to be Whale Rider. And by the time it ended, I was weeping, and I called New Zealand the next day and invited it to have its world premiere in Toronto. And they came, and Witi Ihimaera, the Maori elder whose novel it was based on, came, and the young girl who was the star, everyone came. And it won the Audience Award at Toronto and went on to become a huge success, a huge hit in this kind of legendary film in New Zealand. But if someone else had been emptying the drawer, excuse the Boston accent, it would not have been played in the festival. And in fact, the woman whose place I was taking that year came to see it and said, oh, she never would have programmed it. And when I told this to Nikki Caro, she said, oh, it's been like that all along for this film. This film has made its way in the world.
But
And, yeah.
the lead actress in that film wasn't born when they first started to look for an actor, for
Exactly.
somebody to be in it. It sort of had to wait until she was the right age. I mean, just like I thought that she'd put a spell on it that the right person would see it, which was you.
Yep.
And so that's again the confidence game of being so sure that your work will end up eventually in some safe and collected and preserved state that it'll continue to exist.
That's wonderful.
You know, which again is value, believing in oneself. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So the last question I would ask is just a question about questions. What questions are on the horizon, or what questions are you kind of wrestling with, or kind of struggling with, or groping after? I mean, like, what are there areas that you're really kind of, like, we need to be working on this, we need to be thinking about this, or this is a rich vein of exploration?
Well, I suppose for me, I'm really thinking a lot about how the change in technologies for film and video is changing audience relations, is changing the nature of public space, is taking away, is subtracting from the equation the whole notion of audience, because the word viewer is replacing the plural word audience. And for me, it's a feeling of loss, because those social spaces have been really important to me, and they still do exist in film festivals. But it worries me. It worries me in terms of what that means for the kind of work that's going to be valued. Also, I think that the scale of film is changing, the scale of video is changing, and I'm curious about what that implies for the kind of work that's going to be made, how that's going to be affected, and how these technologies are beginning to intersect and merge. And how long do we wait now for the first feature film shot on Google Glass? I don't know. My neighbor already showed me the one he made of the hill that I walk up. So, it can't be very far away. But I worry about that, given the severe gendering of technology now and the gendering of the software industries, and the ways in which these are being pushed in very particular directions that are not multidimensional. So, I don't know. I'm curious about it, and I'm worried about it. Yeah.
Well, I think a lot about evolution in our species and how we're shifting, and I think that we're all in the midst of a massive change, and that we have to be open to the hybridity of how this evolution is going to affect us. I mean, I think that microbiologically that there is a lot of gender stifling as well as racism, and I think that what you have to be is ruthless in incorporating your belief systems, your memories, and the memories of your culture in a form that can last, because that's what will be that's how we'll be thought of in the future, yeah, just for our future, as our legacy. I think you have to think about legacies. That's important.
Oh, that's a beautiful thing to statement to end on. So
Great.
thank you very much.
Thanks,
This will
Ann.
end the
Thank you.
the dialogue.